Hello everyone, and welcome to the Paul Chandler Show. I'm your host, Paul Chandler. Today we're going to be discussing neoplasms in the diagnosis book. And one issue though that we have with the neoplasms is not only the location, and when we're choosing the correct location, ensuring that we're getting as specific as we can. However though, once we get the location down, there's 6 different columns that we're looking at, all based on the status of the neoplasm. And some of the columns are what I call a pop and soda scenario. So for example, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I live in Orlando, Florida now, but I call this a nice, refreshing can of pop. I do love my Mountain Dew Kickstarts. So I call it a pop. A lot of people call it soda. If you're in Georgia, everything's a freaking Coke. I won't go into there about that because let's just say do not call my Mountain Dew a Coke. But that's the issue though we have with once you get the location down, the status of those columns, there's several different variances, if you will, of the words that they can call it. And I use that phrase as a pop and soda scenario. For example, I say pop, if you say soda, we both know what we're talking about. A nice, refreshing can of Mountain Dew Kickstart. So that's what we're discussing today, neoplasms. Good evening, my fellow Americans. I'm here tonight to discuss with you a matter of major importance that we have in our country at this time. All the different variances of terminology that we have with coding the neoplasms using the neoplasm table. And tonight, I'm going to be discussing with you and letting you know of all the different variations of words because one provider may document it one way, another provider may provide the documentation in another way. Yet, it is up to you medical coders of the world, to be able to decipher that terminology and ensuring that you're choosing the correct column in the neoplasm table. Choosing the correct column will help ensure proper documentation, not only for the claim submission, but also for treatment of the patient from one provider to the next. So while we're looking at the neoplasm table, the first of the 7 columns is simply the location. As we drop down, we're getting more specific as we go along. One thing to remember though with the location is, for example, if the provider documents that they have a neoplasm on the elbow is not in the elbow. On is referring to the skin of the elbow. Remembering that the largest organ that we have on the human body is right there in front of you when you're looking in the mirror. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is the human skin. So after we have the first column decided with the most specific location from the drop downs or the drill downs, however you choose to describe them, next we need to decide which one of the 6 columns based on the condition of that neoplasm are we going to choose. Now again, ladies and gentlemen, the task above us is not an easy one. It will take hard work and dedication. Focusing on that documentation that the provider has given you as a coder to be able to decide which one of the 6 columns you should choose. Now, with the first 3 of the 6 columns being some form of malignancies. According to the neoplasm table, we have primary malignancy, secondary malignancy, and CA in situ. Now, going from primary to secondary, simply just thinking outside of the neoplasm table, what does primary mean? What does secondary mean? Primary means first, secondary means second. So as far as metastasis or neoplasm, a cancerous cell. For example, if it starts out in the patient's breast, then spreads to the lymph nodes. Breast cancer would be primary, lymph nodes would be secondary. CA in situ, that means it's contained in one spot. Think of, for example, a water balloon. If you may or may not be on the 2nd floor on a roof, and before you throw it out the window or over the roof and it smashes someone on the ground, that water balloon is still contained. Still contained just like how our thoughts need to be while we are choosing the correct code on the neoplasm table based on the provider's documentation. So with that water balloon in your hand, before that water balloon pops, all the water is contained inside that plastic. So with that balloon containing the water inside, that's an example of caught in situ. Or for example, if you remember back from the 1980s, those commercials of cracking an egg on the side of a pan on top of the stove. Think of the egg before it's cracked. That's caught in situ. The yolk, it's still contained in the eggshell. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all those variances as far as the documentation that we can have. So primary, primary, yes means first still, hasn't changed. Secondary, still means second. That has not changed. However, though, there are several different variations to describe a secondary neoplasm. It can state secondary. It can state that the primary location has metastasized to the secondary. So for example, breast cancer first and lymph node second. The breast cancer metastasized into the lymph nodes. That would make the primary and the lymph node secondary. The breast cancer extended into the lymph nodes. Same scenarios. The breast cancer invaded into the lymph nodes. Same scenario in there as well. So when we're using the documentation, remember that there's more than one way to describe a secondary neoplasm. Now with caught in situ, a couple notations about that. For one, it can only be done by a pathologist. So watch out on the documentation on who you are coding for. When you're coding by the pathologist, he or she has to make that determination. Caught in situ. Based on their education, they're the only one qualified to decide, are we dealing with an egg yet? Or has that egg been cracked against the pan? Or does it still contain one egg by itself? Is the shell still intact? Now, if you do not work for a pathologist's office, or if you're not coding for the pathologist, you can still use the caught in situ column. If, and only if, my fellow Americans, you are quoting the pathologist report. If you have that, then the provider, whether it be internal medicine, family practice, cardiology, whatever other specialty it is, they're not providing the documentation themselves, they're quoting the pathologist report. They're not diagnosing the patient, they're quoting the pathologist report. So if you are a non-pathologist coder, and you have that pathology report back, it's signed off as by a pathologist that this neoplasm is caught in situ, then, as the coder, you can securely use that caught in situ column. Now, if you do not have that report back, for example, pending path and lab, but if the neoplasm is only in one location, you would use the primary column instead. Now, I know you may be thinking, well, how can I have a primary if I don't have a secondary? That's just the thing. We're not stating that there is a secondary yet, but we're stating by using that primary column, if it's pending path and lab, we're not 100% certain that it is in one location. We will know when we get that report back. Now, with the caught in situ column, there are a few other synonyms that we have besides just caught in situ. Your documentation can say just in situ, with the CA in front being carcinoma. You can also say, instead of caught in situ or in situ, your documentation by the pathologist could state intraductal or intraepithelial or non-infiltrating, non-invasive or pre-invasive. All of those synonyms mean caught in situ. Now, while the first three columns that we have are the malignancy side, then we have the benign. Benign is a non-invasive, non-metastasized. That's the good kind. Then the last two columns that we have are uncertain behavior and unspecified behavior. Now, essentially, both those columns are stating, I don't know, but all depends on who is saying that I don't know. The uncertain behavior can only be diagnosed by a pathologist, because if that's the case, they're unable to make any determination of benign or malignancy. Say, for example, that the biopsy sample provided to them was too small. They can request the provider to come back and have the patient return for a larger biopsy sample size. No matter what the reason is, maybe to ensure that's not a false positive or false negative, whatever it could be, only a pathologist can use the uncertain behavior column. Same rule though, unspecified behavior. That's the internal medicine, family practice. Any non-pathologist saying that they just don't know what it is. The non-pathologist, again, let's say internal medicine, they can use the uncertain column if they're quoting the pathologist report. If they have that report, they're not diagnosing the patient as being uncertain based on the morphology. They're just quoting the pathologist report. Now, if they do not have that report back, then yes, they must use the unspecified behavior column. Either if their documentation does not state what the status of that neoplasm is, or if it states that they're just unable to determine at this time, or they just don't know what it is, then they would use the unspecified behavior column. So I do recommend that at the beginning of the neoplasm table, that you jot down those synonyms for the other columns that we have, because that can be very difficult, and ensure proper coding is something that we must do. Ensuring proper coding based on the documentation, that helps the code selection. That helps the provider get the highest reimbursement possible for the work that they do. Not only that, does that help proper continuously transfer of care from one provider to another. Now, I do thank you for attending this educational moment on the neoplasm table columns and the definitions of those. My fellow Americans, have an awesome rest of the night. If you like this video and want to see more, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's so easy. It's right there. A little button. Just push it. Subscribe. I got all night. Nothing else to do. Just subscribe.